welcome to the Grognards of Gaming. I am Rob, the Grognard Dog, and with me, as always, is my very good friend and longtime gaming companion.
Miracle Mike.
Excellent. So, Mike, today we decided we were going to talk about favorite source material. I've always let you go first, but I think this time let's change it up a little bit, and I'll get started, and then I'll popcorn it back to you. So there are really, I want to break my source material up into three categories. So I'm going to start with the first category, and this is genre specific sources. So to a certain extent, the sources that we rely upon are genre specific, not entirely. There are certain meta sources, and so that I'll talk about in my second when you popcorn back to me. I'll talk about that as a second group. But you know, you got to pick your favorite I guess genres, and then decide what they are your favorite because they're based on certain sources. So for me, I love the mixture of sword and sorcery with science fiction to get space opera or space fantasy, which is what Star Wars is. And that's why, as I mentioned in an earlier episode of Grognards of Gaming, that's one of my, if not my favorite um, settings, is because you can combine the tropes from both of those very freeform, very liberating genres into one. And so, of course, Star Wars, the films are going to be a great source for me, not just in running Star Wars games, but even in running science fiction games or in running fantasy games. But here's an interesting thing, which is the tropes that you find in Star Wars or other space fantasies, uh, being a mixture of both science fiction and sword and sorcery, you can actually convert any of those tropes, any of those stories into other genres. You can create a western based on tropes that you find in Arthurian legend, in sword and sorcery, in space fantasy, and just make it mundane. I think that the whole Pirates of the Caribbean franchise was the Star Wars universe without the space. They just said, let's tell the overarching story of Star Wars, but take the science fiction space out of it. And what do you get? You get Pirates of the Caribbean or your rebels, that they're fighting against the British Empire instead of rebels fighting against the evil empire. How do you have how do you have lawless outlaws become the heroes? Well, you make the government that they're fighting against to be corrupt or somehow oppressive. And so I thought that was a brilliant stroke, the creation of the Pirates of the Caribbean franchise, and it's a perfect example of how you can use Star Wars as a source. You can use space fantasy as a source for other genres. Of course, if you're just going to go the way of fantasy and you're not going to add the space element to it, you can still draw uh, from space fantasy. But I think that Tolkien, of course, is the one who, at least in our lifetime, really synthesized all of the diverse sources from folklore, from Western folklore, European folklore, and brought it all together into a unified legendarium. So that was a stroke of brilliance. What I love about Tolkien is he did hint that there are other continents in Middle Earth, not just uh, Ardor, not just Eriador, which is supposed to be Europe. He also hinted to to southern lands, the Harad, which is various sort of Middle Eastern in the vague ways that he talked about it, and the Far Harad, which is supposed to be like Africa, and Rune, which is supposed to be the Far East. And so he lets you know that there are other cultures in this world. And so if you want to run a game um, in the Tolkien world, you can just use what he did as a model. He went into Norse mythology, he went into English mythology, and he drew out these elements. You can go into Japanese mythology, you can go into Chinese mythology and Mongolian mythology and find out what are the spirits, the fairy tales of that, and unify it and make an Eastern realm. And TSR did this with what was the name of that source book? Eastern Adventures and the
Oriental
Oriental
Adventure.
Oriental Adventures. They did that. They did a really fantastic job of that. And I remember when that book came out, and we were in the throes of our advanced Dungeons and Dragons gameplay as a gaming group when we were teenagers, and we marveled over that book. It was really well done. You could do the same with the various folklore of the various African cultures. You can use Tolkien as a model, the way he put his legendarium together, even if you don't use Tolkien's tropes in particular. So that's one of the reasons why he is an inspiration for me. He is a source, and then other popular genres are superheroes, where you really would draw from comic books. It might be westerns, and of course you could draw from the western pulps, western movies, western novels, western TV shows of the 50s and 60s. Those are great sources. If you're going to run strict sci-fi without the fantasy element, all the great authors like Asimov and Heinlein and Bradbury are great sources. And last but not least, the history books. History books for me are a fantastic source of inspiration. And all of these things that I mentioned are right here on the bookshelf behind me. Here's a book on world mythology. Here's Bullfinch's mythology. So Greek mythology is fantastic as sources. I've got right here. I've got a plethora of Star Wars books. So they're on my shelf. I've got here's all of my Tolkien books. There's just one to show you. Behind me, here's folklore. So 100 Wicked Witch Stories, and of course, we can't leave it all out. We can't leave this out because this really is the fundamental canon of the West. It would be the Judeo-Christian tropes of the stories of the Bible, where Jerusalem meets Athens is really where Western culture comes about. It's at that intersection. And so if you're telling stories in the Western mold, that's where a lot of our tropes come from. So those are my genre specific inspirations. How about you? Do you have genre specific inspirations?
So, where your earliest maybe space opera, mine earliest were probably in Sword and Sorcery. Now, you've already mentioned Tolkien, but he was not my first. You're going to laugh when I tell you who my first is, and it's not going to be a surprise to you. Chronicles of Prydain by Lloyd Alexander, who was a Philadelphia native.
Ah, I didn't know.
Um, yes, and people think, oh, you may never have heard of this. Everybody has heard of his stories. His second book is probably one of the most favorite Disney animations of all time,
Oh,
The Black Cauldron.
ah,
Yeah, this is where Terran Wanderer came from.
I knew it. I knew Taran Wander. Yeah, I was waiting for you to say Taran Wander. Yes, yes.
Yes,
Okay.
yes. But that's the Chronicles of Prydain by Lord Alexander was a sword and sorcery. In addition, the Arthurian legends were more my originals from a genre perspective. Um, so I really did enjoy those. I did get into sci-fi, but my sci-fi is probably first Star Trek before Star Wars, which is probably more the pure sci-fi you were talking about as opposed to the sci-fi fantasy. Um, and I continue to joke with people all the time. They had flip phones before we did. They had tablets before we did. They have inspired many technological advances.
Yeah.
Um, Now, after that, I do like Star Wars. I do like the idea, and like you said, where you can bring everything together from there. Other more popular pop culture examples. Space westerns, Serenity, Firefly.
Mm,
Huge, huge, huge crossovers for information. Um, Definitely mythology, legends, things of that nature. You mentioned Oriental Adventures. There's another one which I believe I still have on my shelf. I'll have to go look. Legends and Lore, which went across everything: Norse, Malaysian, different Asian cultures, different Middle Eastern cultures. And here are, here are the beings that are, here are the mythological characters that are all through all these, and work them right into. Now it's interesting because the early version we had a broader cornucopia of cultures, and they actually took a lot out the next time they published that book.
I think you're talking about deities and demigods. Is that the?
Yes,
Yes, they did
yes,
take them out. That's correct.
they did take a lot of them out at that time. But that kind of thing, those kind are the kind of genre that I came up with. Also, Western. I love Westerns. I've run a Western campaign. I love Westerns. Um, used to do the spaghetti Westerns,
Sergio
the
Leone type.
Sergio
Yes.
Leone, the original Clint Eastwood, Man with No Name, the original Django before Jamie Foxx did it.
Hmm.
Things of that nature that I used to watch. Also, you mentioned superheroes. I am still to this day an avid comic book collector. To this day, I still collect comic books. A lot more selective these days about what I collect. But I joke. I actually had to tell my nephew, Brian's son, that I had comic books older than his father. So,
That's funny.
so that those are a lot of the base genres. And again, you mentioned the Bible. You know, basic good and evil can definitely be found there. Also, and we talked about this last time. The idea of a long-term continuing story can be found there, which is where some of that, that is some from Catholic school where we were both exposed to, where we studied the Bible from Old Testament to New Testament, and it's a continuing story. This person, this son of this son of this son of this son, and it was a continuing story, you know, all the way through, which gave us that idea of how things continue and how things have history. Um, so it is all of them are very good genre specific store, specific sources. Um, and they do cross. So it's another one for me, which you did not mention, which is what brought vampire to the group. I'm also a very large horror fan.
Hmm.
Um, I tell people, I haven't seen a good horror and probably I haven't seen anything that scared me in probably about 20 years. It's really hard to. I've read things that have scared me, but I
Hmm.
have not seen an actual presentation of horror that scared me. But horror is and this is something we also mentioned before. Horrors do not always end in a nice way. So that gave me the idea of source material for things that don't necessarily always end in favor of the hero.
Yes,
Although even mythology does that. Mythology has stories about that too, where the hero does not always win.
that's right.
So it's all good source material, and it's we have a lot of commonalities. We came up a little different. We have a lot of commonalities though, and it's and some of that comes from having gamed together and searched for things together. And oh, I read this book. You got to read this book. We got to include this in the next adventure and the next different thing like this, or we got to try one of these. I asked you the one time, can we do like a Blade Runner type story? That was another, there's another good sci-fi trope right there.
That's a great one.
Um, although, and I hate to say it, if you want genre specific, you don't you see it now, but you don't see it. And I hate to say it, you don't see it like you did in the bad movies in the '80s.
Hmm.
All the sword and sorcery movies, all the sci-fi movies, all the dystopian movies, all like that. Amazing source of genre specific material. You know, some of which people are bringing them back now. Where can you go find this movie? Have you seen this movie? Blah blah blah, so on and so forth. But those kinds of things. So yeah, it's all very genre specific. I agree with you. So, but it's so much source material,
Yeah,
and it's all to your personal taste. But don't close out stuff that it may not be your taste, but you may find some use for it regardless.
right. And I always loved those gaming companies. World of Darkness was in particular for this, where they would include in the core rule book a bibliography at the end, and they would suggest reading for you if you
Yes.
wanted to learn the tropes and learn more about the genre. I thought that was magnificent, and there's so much about World of Darkness, White Wolf, that I loved, and that was a big part of it. So, okay. So those are genre specific, and a few of the things that we mentioned also fall into my second category, which are meta sources. So, of course, the biblical canon is going to be a meta source because it is the foundation of all storytelling in the West. And so, the thing about storytelling is human beings are wired. We have evolved to see the world through a story. And stories are the most compelling way to teach. They're the most compelling way to propagate culture. They're the most compelling way to propagate knowledge. You can propagate knowledge through argument, and it is probably the second most effective way to do so. And I think that's what the Greeks hit upon. But the Judeo-Christian tradition has lasted longer than the Greeks because the Jews realized that storytelling is the real way human beings see the world. And so the biblical canon is the foundation for all of that. And Carl Gustav Jung, understood this. And anybody who reads Jung is a student of Jung. Jung tells us that storytelling enables us to move forward confidently in the chaos in the face of chaos itself. Particularly, the biblical canon teaches us that. On top of that, on top of the biblical canon, well, perhaps off to the side and parallel a little bit after, but parallel with the biblical canon, we have Greek mythology. So Greek mythology is also striving towards these same fundamental truths. It approaches it in sort of a less of a faith based way and more of a reason based way, the reason of Athens, that is. But it's still done in a storytelling style. And so I think that Bullfinch's mythology is a critical book. Everyone should have that on their bookshelf. That is a real meta source. You can use the stories in Bullfinch's mythology across genres, and you can expand out. I mean, there are mythologies all over the world, not just Greek mythologies. And so, if you get a good book on world mythology, you can do the same, and you can tell other types of stories, not just the types of stories we're familiar with in the West. And then, of course, there's the classical literature of Western culture, and if you're in the East and you're telling stories in the Eastern style of storytelling, there is classical literature, in the East as well. But I'm familiar with Western classical literature, and we're talking about things like, well, the Odyssey and the Iliad, I guess, could also be Greek mythology, but Don Quixote, Oedipus Rex, gosh, the Divine Comedy, all of these things are the classics. These are classical literature. Dickens, oh my gosh, you could draw from Dickens, and I've done that so many times. So, classic literature, Greek mythology, biblical canon, folklore, these things are meta sources. How about you? Do you have meta sources that are not genre specific but that help you in multiple genres?
So, yeah, definitely not genre specific. Some literature, and you've mentioned some of the literature. Other places I've gone are Edgar Allan Poe is a
Mm,
wonderful source of material.
mhm,
Um, but also, and this is something more recent to me that I've discovered through people I work with, through different things. I've worked with a lot of people of an African background, a lot of people of an Indian, not Native American, but Indian background, um, where I've gotten some exposure to the stories and the stories and the tales out of the Hindu religion that are all passed down by word of mouth, and the African tradition that are all passed down by word of mouth, but also Native American tradition that are passed on by word of mouth. A lot of parables, a lot of how did the world come about stories and things of that nature, and some of them. One of the prime examples that made me really think about this recently. Um, the television show Picard, if you've ever watched that,
mhm,
and Discovery, the
mhm,
Star Trek Discovery, they had a thing called short takes. And one of those short takes was a story told about a child in Africa and how the stars came to the sky. And it was a story I'd never heard before. And somebody had found this and turned it into something related to Star Trek. So I,
mhm.
of course, came across it, and so these kind of parables and things like that. But And it's not even that, it's other. So you want to talk about a meta source and you talk about storytelling, and think about this. When you get together with people you've not seen for a long time, and you sit around the table and you have a meal with them or you break bread with them, you sit and exchange stories. And even things that have come out of real life and these discussions. Let me tell you a story about what happened since the last time you saw me. Family, friends, things of that nature. This is a kind of meta source. I've gotten inspiration from somebody telling me about a trip that they took to somewhere they had never been before, and a meta source like that. Um, Non-genre specific meta source, and you've done this, and you did this so well when we were young that it blew my mind. And I'll give you the source, and it's immediately going to stick to you what you did with it. Don't Lose My Number by Phil Collins.
Yep,
Music. You did a whole Star Frontiers campaign based off of that song. You
I
took a
did.
song and said I'm going to write a whole campaign around this song, and little aspects and little phrases in this song are going to come up in the campaign. So music is a wonderful non-genre specific meta source.
Yeah, it really is. And it can also be genre specific. If you listen
It
to
can.
Yes, Genesis, and those old prog rock bands of the 70s, that is a
Yeah.
wealth of material for sci-fi and fantasy, man. I mean, holy cow. Just take any 20-minute Yes song and break down each of the names of each of the suites in that 20 minutes to, that's a session right there.
Yeah. Peter Gabriel's Genesis and a musical box, something like that.
Oh, for
Exactly.
sure. Oh yeah,
So
I mean, I can't tell you how many times I've had a Burgermeister, and I named him Moribund the Burgermeister because of the Peter Gabriel song. Yeah, absolutely.
so
Totally. Very great source. Music is a great
yeah.
meta source. Okay, fantastic. So, all right, that brings us to my third category, and I just as I alluded to meta sources when I was talking about genre specific inspirations, I alluded to this third category when I was talking about meta sources, and this third category is archetype, because archetype is absolutely the fundamental of storytelling. And again, Carl Gustav Jung, whom I mentioned when we were talking about meta sources, he wrote extensively about archetypes. And you know, Jung explains to us that archetypes are they're more than just they're more than just patterns. They're more than just icons of storytelling. They are tied to us as human beings biologically. They have psychological significance. They represent distilled patterns of human behavior that have evolved over hundreds of thousands of years. And they reveal the structure of reality to us as we perceive reality through our human senses. So archetypes are absolutely critical. And so if you're struggling with inspiration, if you're struggling with how to put a story together, or what kinds of characters or what kinds of stories to tell, look to the archetypes. So, Star Wars, the original trilogy, did this perfectly. All of the characters are archetypes. And I think this is the problem with the newest incarnation of Star Wars films is they say that they're creating films nowadays for modern audiences. But what they're really doing is they're creating films today for postmodern audiences. And the problem with the postmodernists is they reject overarching narratives. The postmodernist philosophy rejects meta narrative. And unfortunately for the postmodernists, meta narrative is how human beings see the world. And that's why this sort of new Hollywood is just not everybody's going under. Disney's going under. All these companies are going under because they are rejecting archetypes. They're trying to force new archetypes upon us. And you just can't do that. You can't socially engineer archetypes. Archetypes evolve with humans. And so, you if you stick to the archetypes that have evolved socially as humans have evolved physically, you will hit on storytelling magic. What makes a story really reach an audience member, really reach a viewer, really reach a reader, is the inclusion of archetypes. Now, you also have to add a personal element into it, because if you don't add a personal element into it, the archetypes can be too uh, abstract, and you don't feel that human connection. But if you make it too personal and you remove the archetypes from it, then there's no emotional resonance. So, um, you know, look to your archetypes, and you can, it's the princess, it's the knight, it's the evil king's brother, look at great films like The Lion King, Disney's animated Lion King. You've got, that is chock full of great archetypes. The villain is a great archetype. Yeah, so I can't emphasize that enough. That is where it really all stems from. It stems from archetypal stories and archetypal characters.
So I see that and I understand that. So I'm going to bring you back to something you had mentioned previously, which makes me think of archetypes. Are Do you think archetypes are cultural? And the reason I say that is because um, I'm remembering you telling a story about one of your players who had a more Asian cultural background.
Mhm.
And in your pulp game, they sacrificed themselves, which was within their archetype,
Mhm.
as opposed to the Western archetype, which would have been get everybody out, don't leave anybody behind.
Right. Well, I think
So,
that there's a difference between archetypes and tropes. So I think I don't think there's a difference among cultures of archetypes. I think, well, I named the Lion King as a perfect example. That comes from African folklore, and
right,
you've got the good king, you've got the redeeming son, you've got the evil king's brother, just like you do in Hamlet. I mean, here's England and Africa, Northern Europe and Africa, and
yeah,
yet you see those same archetypes. And even the killer character that you're referring to, from my Malaysian friend Jason's
yes,
contribution to our pulp game, he is the sacrificial hero. Really, he was the sacrificial anti-hero, and that is an archetype even in the West.
right,
But what we weren't used to was the story ending tragically for him. For our archetype, we've got Obi-Wan Kenobi. Obi-Wan Kenobi sacrifices himself, but he's got a protege, Luke Skywalker, who carries the torch, literally carries the torch, the lightsaber. You know, in,
lightsaber, right,
in the Eastern tropes, you don't necessarily have that protege. The killer doesn't necessarily have a protege to carry the torch. It ends with the killer's death, and so
right.
that's what we weren't expecting. But the archetypes are there. You can't. It can't be if it is the case that it differs from culture to culture, then it's not an archetype by definition, because archetypes are connected to us biologically as
Okay.
humans.
All right, that's fair. I would agree with that. I understand. I'm just seeing where you're going because when you're talking about Hollywood and people lacking of investment, the first thing that popped into my mind is the the sitcom phenomenon,
Mm, tell me.
where it's everything is everything is encapsulated, everything is handled within that half an hour, and it may not continue.
Mhm.
And you've had other systems, you've had a mix of those where it is a continuing idea or something to invest in, where they build or where they don't. And it made me think of that, episodic, the episodic nature of things, where
Mhm.
you're not investing in the archetypes, you're investing in the quick satisfaction,
Mhm.
if
Exactly.
that makes any sense. So
That
you're looking for the quick hit and the quick satisfaction as opposed to the deeper satisfaction or the longer. It's the short game versus the long game, which is where you're seeing things go now, as opposed to, so they're not using the archetypes of the sort, so they're going for the quick laugh or the quick win or the yeah, quick dollar, as it might have been.
Yeah.
I'm not going to do the archetype. I'm going to get the most popular actor of the time to play this role,
Mhm.
even if it's not within their range or whether it's within their range or not. So,
Right.
and
Right.
I get where you're going with that. So, but yeah, I agree that the archetype type struggles. The underdog is an archetype.
Yes.
Everybody roots for the underdog. The rags to riches story is an archetype. Things of that nature. I agree with you. So it's they all make great stories, and it is definitely the core building blocks of when you are building a story. You know, because it has a well defined, as you say, beginning, peak, and end.
Right. Yeah, and yeah, what you just said about what you just right now said reminded me. You said rags to riches. That's an archetype. Yes, archetypes don't necessarily have to be characters. Uh, Things are archetypal that are simply part of human experience. So, you know, uh, love, right? Love and romance. I mean, for heaven's sakes, love stories are archetypal because, well, romance. The procreative act precedes humanity. And for this is why again I have to point to Disney. Disney's re-envisioning of Snow White without the love story, without her falling for the prince. People just when the actress who was hired to play Snow White simply said, "Yeah, we're not doing that this time." And as a matter of fact, the prince was a creepy stalker. That immediately turned people off because that is part and parcel of the archetype. That's tied to our biology. If you're going to take that out of the story, you don't have the story anymore. And so now a competing media empire is going to do their own version of Snow White on the 100th anniversary of Disney introducing Snow White, the original Snow White, to the masses. And their version, I guarantee you, is going to do better because they are determined to stay true to the original tale. There's a reason why the original tale resonated. It stuck to archetypes. And so if you try to take that out, you're dooming your game to failure. You're dooming your story to failure. Archetypes are the essence of all meta sources. They are the essence of meaningful genre specific sources. That's where it all stems from.
All right, fair enough. I don't think any more needs to be said on that. I think that covers it.
Fantastic. All right, I'm going to put you on the spot, Mike. Do you have
Oh,
do you have do you have an idea maybe for the next time we get together? Is there anything that you're really itching to talk about?
we talked about it last episode.
Okay.
Let's do, and this might lean into some of your this archetype work and
Okay.
expanding on the archetype work. We talked last time about things like the happy ending versus the not so happy ending,
Love it.
and
Let's do it.
you know that kind of story theme. There we go. Story theme: happy ending versus not happy ending. You know, do you introduce romance into your campaign or do you leave it aside? That kind of those kind of themes would be something good to explore. I don't know how
Fan-
to sum it up into one. Themes is the only way that I can, you know, thematic items within your gaming and your storytelling.
Okay. I think we got it. Perfect. All
All
right.
right.
Ladies and gentlemen, tune in next time for the Grognards of Gaming, where you're going to hear Miracle Mike and Rob, the Grognard dog, talk about thematic storytelling. All right. Take care, everybody, and thanks for listening.
Until next time.